The goal of this session is really to figure out what we collectively as a group want to do tomorrow morning to make and take the greatest advantage of this entire meeting. And just to reiterate why that's so important, for those of you that don't know me, my name's Bob Robbins. I've been in this business for a long time. I started out as a program officer at NSF back in '87. We created a program in database activities in the life sciences. I went to the genome database at Hopkins. I went back to DOE and genome informatics, and then I went off and got involved in administrative computing and served as VP of IT for the Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center for 15 years, and then retired a couple years ago. In that time stretch, my old boss at NSF in the days, John Woolley, was asking me if I was willing to go to a workshop on biodiversity and genome stuff, and I said, sure, tell me when it is. John is one of these guys, I think I've lost count, he's at 8 or 9 times lymphoma survivor. He keeps getting recurrences and keeps surviving it. And he was in the middle of another recurrence, and he said, I'm kind of busy dealing with my health stuff. And I said, you need some help? And he said, yes. And so I've been involved in this RCN for GSC stuff ever since, trying to help facilitate these kinds of meetings and plan them and pull them off and make them happen. An RCN award from NSF, a Research Coordinating Network award, is specifically given to a group, to a PI, and to a group of people to accomplish useful changes in a community. That's why it's a research coordinating network. You're trying to coordinate and improve activities across the community, often by bringing groups together that might otherwise not get together or something like that. And the purpose of that award was explicitly, if you look at the original proposal, to bring together work on metagenomics data standards coming largely out of Europe with the Genome Standards Consortium, which were some of the first people to really think seriously about the metadata necessary to make metagenomics information useful. And more than any other kind of data, metagenomics data have to have a lot of metadata associated with them. Because when you're just sequencing up DNA that you find in a bucket of water or a shovelful of dirt, if you don't have a record of where the bucket of water came from or the shovelful of dirt came from, it's like, and the ball scores yesterday were 8-2, 3-6, and 4-0. You know, you've got the data, but it's not as useful as it might be if you had the metadata telling you who the players were. And so that was coming out of the Genomic Standards Consortium. And then in the US, a lot of biodiversity work, a lot of emphasis on biodiversity, long-term ecological research and that sort of thing. And it was clear at the time that John put in the proposal for the RCN for GSC that traditional biological communities, ecology and biodiversity, were recognizing that sequence data was going to become an important part of what they were recording about their sphere of interest, and that embedding sequence data into an ecological context and into a biodiversity context was going to become more important for just the sequencers, other than the pure medical sequencers or those with a real focus on it. So the idea was to bring these communities together and try to facilitate forward movement. We adopted a mantra that, as a code version, said that n is greater than n plus 1, and n minus 1 is greater yet. And what that referred to was number of data standards. That if you can bring two communities together with two different standards, and out of it, and you had n standards to begin with, m over here and q over there, something like that, and merge them and not acquire a new data standard, that's better than if when two communities run into each other, you create yet another data standard to meet the needs of the intersection. And that if along the way you could actually render one of the data standards obsolete and encompass it under it to go down to n minus 1, that's even better. And the reason that's even better is because there will always be new communities with specific needs cropping up and creating new standards to meet their local needs. So since we know there's going to be growth, if we don't have pruning, a goal of pruning at some point or another, it's just an explosion, a runaway explosion. So that's the background. The RCN for GSC award funded part of this workshop, I think about half, and Jim's not here to talk about the other half. But basically, this meeting will be a success if it produces ongoing activities. If it's just an interesting meeting, we just come to it, we all have fun, we all discuss stuff, we go home, we forget about it, it's less of a success. So that's why this session right now of saying, okay, we want to leverage everything we've talked about here in the last day and a half, 2 days, into stuff we can do concretely and specifically tomorrow morning, and then to inform activities beyond that. So that's kind of the background, and then I'm here just to coordinate, not to announce what we need to do tomorrow morning. And John Deck is going to be capturing it and putting it up here. In the hallway, you had one thought of what a next step would be. You want to throw that out?
I would like to have a concrete example, go through a concrete example with some subsection of Darwin core to figure out, using all this list of best practices and so on, what to do about that subsection. I would do it based on what used to be a recurrence, organism, separate out organisms, and collection objects. And we do the thought experiment, make a report of what that should look like, get feedback necessary to know if that was done correctly, and with that knowledge it should be possible to create this semantic layer for Darwin core with some level of confidence that could then be tested.
Okay, and
so is that developing a proposal for doing that? Is that part of that group, or is it like a formal proposal to the Tadwig governing body, or is it the actual following through the ontology of it?
That's just what I would like to do.
well, I think you're talking about not necessarily seeking official approval for it or funding for it, but simply giving it a test drive. Do some ground truthing.
Stay on these principles and see if I got it right.
Yeah, and then try to sell it.
Yep.
Okay, and that's longer than just tomorrow morning. Do you have specific suggestions for things we as a group could do, either the small breakout group with people around you or something else in plenary session tomorrow to help make that more likely to happen in the next, I mean, with a goal like that, it's always nice to say, and we're going to do this in 3 months. Because we're going to do it at some point in the future.
It's somebody who was confident that they knew what to apply.
So we could just even do it tomorrow morning, or get started tomorrow morning. Okay, that's one suggestion. Yes?
I have a structural suggestion, which this is such a big gathering. I really feel a lot of people's participation is inhibited just because of the size of it. Mm-hmm. So I'm suggesting that we might consider going into some breakouts so that we can have fuller participation among all of, the minds involved here. And then maybe, reassemble to compare notes or, divide and conquer, I don't know. But something that doesn't keep us all in plenary.
Okay, well, the room's big enough that, we could probably break out into 4 groups by just going to 4 corners of the big room in there. So we don't need to have breakout rooms. And just as a matter of procedure, I'll mention that something that I have found very effective in other meeting contexts where you decide to have breakouts sort of spontaneously is what I would call a dynamic breakout topic selection, where you basically start out with something like big sticky notes, the big sticky pads, you put them up on the wall, and anybody who wants to can propose a breakout session, and then after a few minutes of proposing breakout sessions, everybody goes around and signs up for the one they want to participate in, and the 4 that get the biggest number of people signing up for it happen. And then other people go to the others, or the 5, or whatever seems reasonable. And it sounds kind of chaotic, but I've done it in a lot of meetings, and it seems to work reasonably well. It allows the decision to be chosen the topic to be chosen right at the last minute, what people are interested in, and then you have to have a report back, of course, from that. So there's a suggestion of doing something like that tomorrow morning. Yeah, Norman?
Just to add to that, when you do those post-it notes, whoever proposes them, sometimes it's worth like a 30-second just to say what they're going
what it's about, right.
About.
Well, and in a group like this, another approach, another version instead of the post-it groups is basically to say who wants to propose a breakout group, and then you just do it. And then somebody writes it down, and we've got that, and then we post it up later instead of, I'm thinking of even bigger meetings where you tend to need to put the stuff up in the hall. But exactly how we do it, But that's one suggestion, is we do breakouts tomorrow morning and possibly dynamically decide at the last minute what those are going to be, but that doesn't mean we can't suggest them now. And we've got one suggested here. Do you have another specific one in mind?
Well, I mean, Joel was putting up sort of at least 3 proposals for semanticizing Darwin core that I think involve some of your elements of interest, John. So I don't know if we want to, turn a critical eye, try to resolve some of the stuff that's the debates that sort of rages occasionally on the email lists.
Yeah, we could do that. I mean, since we have, this is the first time the idea that I'm aware of, the idea of situating Darwin core within BOFO has come up and been advocated for and considered. So this might be an opportunity to kind of consider that, to take that opportunity. I'm just afraid that, I'm not by no means suggesting that we should go ahead as proposed and say Darwin core is going to be an OBO, BOFO based ontology. But if we're ever going to consider it, maybe now's now's the time, especially if, so I like John's suggestion, and I wondered, like, are you thinking though, I mean, but although that's not necessarily, we don't necessarily need to talk to a Boffo to do that, right? Because he has a bunch of design principles that, you know, even people who aren't fans of Boffo would subscribe to. So maybe they're, I guess what I'm suggesting is even going beyond what John's saying and say, yeah, let's on one pass apply those best principles. But I wonder if we might want to, I wonder if there's time and expertise to continue the little thought experiment that Barry started on the board. And I guess I'm...
Does anybody capture that in Al? I mean, I couldn't read, it wasn't quite legible. I was trying to do it in Protege as he was saying it. But
I have it here, we could put that into Al, but the relation, you have to make up the relations,
I
but.
just tried to do it.
I made it die,
Just
but
open
I didn't do it now.
I think it's a
Drew a
about
picture.
10 minutes.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I mean, depends, for instance, is something that apparently is defined somewhere, but, you know, it's
No.
kind of critical in interpreting some of the relationships that are evident in this
I hope
logic.
I could get a good copy of what he has written down, and I think it would just take me 10 minutes to put it to Owl, but without definitions, of course.
Right, you just open Google and type in a few terms.
But it's,
Well, like
So is there a
being there is-
proposal then to create an OWL version of what Barry drew up, or an OVO version?
Yeah, formalized.
Formalized within the context of BFO?
Sure.
Okay.
And then we could also create some records and load them into Cam's Red Store.
I mean, I think there's some ambiguity with something like being there, the sub-process being there, and the sub-process of observed being there. That's kind of, I mean, I know he was like throwing this out really quickly, but, you know, trying to put your head around exactly how that works. This whole notion of what an observation is, you might be losing something. It just
Is
accept.
anybody sort of confident enough in their own understanding of Buffalo to oversee?
I'm reasonably familiar with it since Barry and I have been having conversations to align ENBO more thoroughly. I've read the manuscripts a few times and discussed some of the points I didn't get. I mean, I come from a biological, ecological background, so I had to start de novo on this sort of stuff. So I could try or attempt to address any sort of uncertainty. No guarantees.
Hey, you want to dial in tomorrow morning and participate in spirit?
I'm sorry?
Said,
Somewhat familiar with.
I guess I was looking towards that end.
I can't claim to know as much about it as Barry, especially Buffalo 2, which is not actually out yet.
So, so I'm not that familiar with the categories in it, but we won't need most of those. So.
But Barry would say you need to start with definitions, so we even know what we're talking about when we say observing
Right.
or depends.
And I'm very familiar with the way that Barry writes definitions because he helps me write definitions every week. So I think I know where he's coming from and what he has expectations for how definitions should be written.
And you build ontologies within the Buffalo framework.
Yes,
Yeah.
well, I'm in the process of building my first two, so I'm learning. Well, I mean, the PO fits within the Buffalo framework, but it was one of those ones that was fit to it afterwards. Because our definitions were clear and logical, it was pretty easy to plug them into the Buffalo. Everything that was a subcategory 1 logically was a subclass of that thing. So it's easy. It's easy to fit things into Buffalo if your definitions are good to begin with. It makes it a lot easier.
one of the things I'm noticing is that all of the suggestions we've got involve, at a high level of generosity, some level of practically testing some of the ideas we've seen in the last day and a half. And the amount of time we're going to have tomorrow, you know, if we start at 9 like we did today, and if we're starting to head for the plains at noon, we've only got about 3 hours in there, which is not a huge amount of time. However, there is nothing on the agenda for this evening. So one possibility is if there is a desire to do some test driving that requires people sitting around laptops and banging ideas together, one suggestion might be, if there are a handful of people who are particularly interested in doing the legwork necessary to do some of this testing, if they wanted to get together at the hotel or something like that, or even, I don't know if we got space here or not, Chris, but you know, that's a potential idea, because otherwise we're just down to 3 hours, and I expect it. I haven't looked at the shuttle trips, but meetings have a way of subliming away at the end instead of ending crisply. Yes?
So, one other idea that obviously Barry's talked about that I think would be useful when there's such a large group is to discuss the idea of governance structures for developing ontologies and the whole ecosystem of ontologies for biodiversity. Whether or not there would be any kind of general agreement to have something like an open biodiversity ontologies boundary, that kind of an idea or not, I don't know. But, it was something I proposed sort of in 2009. It didn't get much uptake, but I think it's because there wasn't a community like that we have here now. So that would maybe sort of take, that could have some kind of plenary discussion or not as a proposal.
Okay, you got that? Got that one? Yep. Okay.
Does that include, Norman, what Barry had suggested about dividing and conquering within Darwin Core?
Yeah, I guess so. And also, you know, what fills the bags in Darwin Core, and you know, how do we pick what they might be, and what, just the general avoiding the reinventing of wheels, which was discussed quite a bit.
Yeah. Well, when I heard him say that, I thought, okay, location. Somebody else has done location. Darwin Core doesn't need to have location. We needed it because we needed to feed stuff to GRIT, right? Can we replace everything we've got satisfactorily from something a little more robust, more pervasive? And then do the same thing with every one of our entities, our classes. In Darwin Core, we've got 7 of them.
Well, does it inflate our thinking in ontology to have something that's called a location where an organism was observed or collected? Using somebody else's thing, but then restricting it with applying it to our domain. Is it?
Does Darwin Core deal with living objects, or does it include paleontological objects? Both. And so with paleontological objects, do you like to distinguish between where the fossil was found and where on Earth it was when it was laid down?
There are some who would like to do so, but are not able to do so.
Okay.
We've got one way to specify location.
It's
In the
not where
flat
it was
system.
collected, not where it was made.
Because you don't have one.
Well, it's just, that's, it could have been laid down a long way from where you found it.
In Darwin Core.
In simple Darwin Core. In
Yeah.
shared Darwin Core, you can have as many locations.
Right, no, okay. Chuck, you were thinking the same
Well, I was
thing.
going to, so this idea of ontology management, or I don't know what he was just proposing. This is sort of a concept that was there, back several years ago for Tadwig, and then we kind of set it on the shelf for a while. But the idea, if we have an ontology, which we don't have yet, and then if we did, then at that point, how would we maintain it? Right now we have this sort of interest group, task group kind of notion, but this might bring another, I don't know, kind of thing. It's something we need to probably think about in Tadwig the next time we.
Tadwig obviously has a stake in this area, but it doesn't have to do it on its own. We can do things collaboratively to sort of channel it into the Tadwig process, so to speak. It wouldn't be too onerous.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking. I can see that it could happen. It's just sort of thing we haven't set out to back out to do.
Well, we've tried to maintain a reasonable relationship with OGS or OGC, for example.
Well, no, I was thinking about the open biodiversity ontology that, like he was just talking about. So, the Darwin Core ontology, whatever. That if we invent that, sort of where would that go? I guess we would need to start thinking about that.
Well, we'd have to basically submit through their rules if it's going to be anything that was, they exist, they have their rules, and we're flexible enough and small enough that we can probably adapt to what they need.
You know, what I haven't heard is a clarification of what are the semantic capabilities that are desired in moving Darwin Core forward. I mean, from my perspective, Darwin Core has had a tremendously positive influence in helping confederate biodiversity records. So where is it currently falling short? And let's address that. Like I heard a little bit about location. Well, is it where the specimen was, collected, or is it where it's stored? I'm not sure if Darwin Core sufficiently disambiguates those. But there are other little areas like that that we should
I'll offer what we think we need to do to go forward with Darwin Core, and that is that Tadwig has become very clearly now a sort of a common meeting place for a number of different communities, each with their different perspectives, and they have greater or lesser overlap. Darwin Core served one very narrow use case, and the way that we need to build and to better manage this set of concepts, we believe, might be helped by basing it in an ontology like this. And so we're basically just trying to understand our conceptualization better across a bunch of related subdomains, so to speak, of biodiversity. And technically what we might be able to get out of that remains to be seen, but Jim Beach and I were just talking about the Red Fort brick in John. We'll see what comes out of that, but right now, this sort of sharing the methodology of conceptualization might be of some benefit. That's a proposition on the table.
I'd say Darwin Core is falling short in that we have no way to connect all of our vast resources to the semantic web.
I mean, one thing that came up at the GBIF meeting was that users of this biodiversity data, not so much the providers, but the users, can only get presence data. And the way it's currently structured, where we're not really documenting collection effort, we can't infer absence. And that's something that the users of the biodiversity data greatly desire. So if you're talking about expanding the use case for our biodiversity data, thinking about making sure that we adequately capture that opportunity where people are doing something other than just willy-nilly collecting, that are actually following a kind of protocol, that you can actually begin to make some statements about absence of taxa under certain sampling protocols. That was something that Don Holborn and colleagues made very clear at the GBIF meeting.
That's ambitious, though.
There are a lot of, I'm not sure where we are. There are a lot of plot databases. Somebody here mentioned it. So all of these plots and actually intended plots, I think we have some programs that are observational that are coming. That, when you start looking at a universal collection of plot data, like GBIF has for collection data, then you get into the thing where you can't have absence. It's like we're doing a plot survey and you're coming away. So I don't know that we've embraced that data set very thoroughly yet.
So this is the thing that when the bird people came to Tadwig, about 6, 7 years, 8 years ago now, whatever, they were looking at ABCD versus Darwin Core. What can we do with this? And I think both of them fall short of this goal. This is exactly what I'm talking about. The bird community comes in, it has a subdomain within biodiversity. They need to publish data to both their own narrower community plus a broader community, maybe even several broader neighbors. If we can enable that, that's what we want to do.
Yeah, what this business of absence, I mean, you remember the comment I think I made or Barry made or something that scientific data is usually collected from an open universe, and therefore you can't take a complement on the data. That's one of the attributes of data from an open universe. The complement doesn't mean anything. But if Darwin Core were to be extended to where there was a very clear notion of what a collection protocol should be able to detect. So you document that this protocol was deployed, and then you document what it found, then the complement of what it found against what is detectable in principle by that protocol gives you what's absent. And if absence is desired, then the idea of defining protocols in terms of taxa that it could find and then what it did find, let's just take the complement, could be pretty useful. That's not just a Darwin Core issue, though. That's kind of a conceptual notion of, it's a database not just of what was collected, but what could have been but wasn't.
Isn't there a sampling effort or sampling protocol term in Darwin Core?
Sampling protocol.
Yeah, what you'd have to do is connect to that if you want to do a complement. In other words, if you didn't want to force people to do their own inferences of what should have been collected and therefore which may be inferred to be absent, is you would collect to the protocol the notion of what's potentially collectible by it.
We don't have an effective way of being explicit, is the problem.
But again, is that an issue with Darwin Core, or is that, or do you have to build a sampling protocol, vocabulary or ontology, and then expect people to use it?
Well, I think what we'd have to do is to propose how these terms would be structured together.
Okay, I just want to do something. I just realized we've got a general issue going on here. One of the questions was asked, what is it that we can't do? What is it that Darwin Core seems pretty good. What's missing? Okay, well, we've kind of indirectly wandered into some documentation of what's missing. So what that suggests is that maybe an effort tomorrow morning to elucidate what's missing, what seems to be the most either desirable or low-hanging fruit or whatever else that could be resolved and solved by or addressed by improvements in Darwin Core. Does that make sense? No? All right.
Do we track that proposal?
I was just saying, I thought we were coming up with some things that were unmet needs, and documenting unmet needs seems useful.
Maybe very general. Can I say?
Yeah.
I'd like to come back to what Norman said earlier about this issue of governance. I noticed, I'm just an invited participant here. I'm not one of the meeting organizers. I'm not really sure what the outcome is intended to be. But when you think about sort of next actions, it seems like one of the next obvious meeting points for many people in this room I see are actually members of the Genomic Standards Consortium, and they're having their meeting in September. Do you want to think about bringing some sort of a resolution from this meeting to that venue? Is that sufficient overlap of these two groups enough to suggest we even want to have that intersection with them? I think that's something this point that Norman raises about governance is a critical one. If we just continue to sort of walk away from it, I think that's to the detriment of what we're trying to do.
Okay, so a report to GSC Oxford. What's the number? 14.
If you're talking about governance, there's two aspects of this. One is the social part of it, and the other one is structural one. So I think one of the ideas might be to use Darwin Core, or what comes next with Darwin Core, as a vehicle for doing this. When you say what is missing, probably we shouldn't be looking at what are the things that are missing, but the thing that's missing is we don't have a framework for adding things that are missing. And so if we're recasting Darwin Core using the principles that we've heard about in the last day and a half, that also provides a framework for being more specific, creating things that are more specific, and adding things that are missing. And then it opens it up to a much broader community. We can actually start to grow this thing, which is the biodiversity ontology, in a way that's that's easy to govern, wherever you decide you're going to do it.
Right.
So that's a subtopic of the governance structure.
Or also a subtopic of what do we do with Darwin Core?
Yeah.
And to answer your sort of implicit question of why are we here and what are we trying to accomplish, one of the goals that those of us who have been driving this for a while, or facilitating is a better word, are hoping for is that by early next calendar year, 2013, that enough ideas will have been stirred up that there will be a significant effort on the part of Darwin Core to say, what can we do now to take what we've learned, the issues that have been raised, and basically do a version update or do some significant changes to improve it based on this. And similarly for GSC. We haven't gone so far as to assume that lightning will strike and there'll be this completely unified approach, but rather that we've tried to facilitate crosstalk for about an 18-month, and by then it'll be a 24-month period, and then the idea will be do something with it, go back, make some changes, and then, as was mentioned, I mentioned somebody at lunch, when you get committed to this stuff, it's like getting committed to painting the Golden Gate Bridge. You're never done. When you get to the north end, you walk back to the south end and start over again. And this will be iterative forever, at least from our point of view, our lifetimes. We'll be either bringing in geography or bringing in who knows what, and this will just go on forever. So it's a permanent commitment. But the ratchet is a lot of ideas, a lot of open exchange for about a year and a half, start to concretize that into steps that might be taken by the individual projects, do that, and then come back together again. That's the goal. So the idea of a report to GSC explicitly out of this meeting is a very solid one.
Tadwig as well.
Yeah, and Tadwig as well. Well, and Neon and Day2PM2 and Barcode of Life. I mean, there's no desire here for any one group to dictate to the others. That's why people are brought together to see, who can use what somebody else is doing. I've always felt that reinventing the wheel is the wrong phrase because most people reapproximate the wheel. And, it's 4 sticks, 5 sticks, 6 sticks, hexagon's good enough, bump, 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 bump. And, so you really don't want to do that. If somebody's going to actually take it all the way to a wheel, fine, use the wheel. But I want to just put in a little aside. As much as I used to agree with Barry that the best approach is this totally generic thing, something that works for everybody. An example that some of you have heard, but I'll share it because not all of you have heard. When I was at Hopkins in the medical school, the urology department was going to database their records for a long time because they were moving into a new building, and they contacted us in the library in the database looking for advice. And we didn't have anything useful to give them really, but I learned a lot from it because what I found out was, from the point of view of the Hopkins urology department, the one field in a medical record that you would think is fall down, trivial, stupid, right? Sex of the patient, male or female. Well, it turns out that Hopkins urology department was one of the first urology departments in the US to deal with cases of sexual ambiguity. So in the urology department, the sex or gender of the patient was an essay that was time dependent and could be couched in terms of phenotypic sex, external phenotypic sex, internal phenotypic sex, endocrinological sex, psychological sex, and all of these were at birth, at puberty, at presentation to the clinic, during treatment, post-treatment. So they were all time-dependent essays on a whole boatload of dimensions. And if you were to tell anybody who was going to implement a medical record system that that's the level of detail that you had to implement in the field gender, in order to make it useful for everybody, most people would say, go pound sand. I'm sticking with M and F, okay? And that's the problem, that when you get into a field where somebody is really dividing things up very finely, their generic tool is somebody else's wicked, crazy complexity.
I think the point of making it generic is not to then predefine all those terms that everybody might ever need someday, but the point is to make your definition of gender broad enough that it will encompass what you hope will be most of the cases people can think of. And then you can...
In a sense, the sort of hierarchical organization helps you out there because all of those are sort of subclasses of something that is, say, if you say sex rather than gender, it's sort of a genetic thing, right?
Yeah.
So, and it rarely changes, if ever, in humans. So at least on the highest level, you can get a very stable definition, and then you can start creating child classes at that level where you can specify other such conditions. Possibly. This is still fuzzy.
And another approach that I've seen used is that you try to build information resources where if you absolutely insist on having a field that nobody else wants, you make it easy for you to build an independent boutique database that connects into the bigger one rather than having to duplicate the parts of it that you want. I mean, that...
He's talking about making it extensible, so
the commitment to extensibility, meaning not just extensibility where I extend it, my resources when I feel like it, but rather I design it so that you can extend it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, in a sense, this is how we hope to design ENVO, and we're working towards that. That at the higher levels, towards the roots, you can have the guy who's taking a photo with his smartphone, who's just not a domain expert, and he can just put on a very broad label. But then, if some biocurator picks that picture up and they want to use it, they can then go deeper into the ontology and use their domain knowledge to give a more specific term.
Who knows what that was? Yeah.
So I think one of the advantages of semanticizing Darwin Core is to give future implementers a more vivid understanding of how these terms would interrelate in whatever type of other schema that you're implementing it into. So for instance, basis of record, right? Basis of record strikes me as like a really important term in Darwin Core. And you could look at what the basis of element is, and you could say things like, for instance, fossil specimen is just disjoint from living specimen. You could say things like human observation has a range that is a human, and it would have a domain that is some sort of an observation by a human. So you can sort of, by putting this into an ontological framework, somebody's trying to implement a database with appropriate kinds of constraints. I know it's open world, but would have a much better idea of how all of these things interrelate, which is currently, I think, hard to do with Darwin Core. So I think there's a kind of a heuristic value of semanticizing Darwin form.
And it will make it easier, I think it will make it easier to write the definitions. It'll be an iterative process. By writing the definitions, that will tell you what needs to go into the into the ontology, that will tell you how to organize them. But right now, if you have definitions that aren't clear what the object is supposed to describe, what the class is, it's very hard to use.
Do we have an idea or a list anywhere of what definitions are in particular need of improvement, or is that something that everyone just has in their heads?
We have a class of problems that Barry is pointing out to us, and we know that the whole idea of recurrence is problematic, has been beat to death already.
Anybody who hasn't spoken up yet? Something to add? Don? What's the Eva take on this?
The governance that Norman mentioned, I think is crucial, one thing we're battling with. To find the boundary of Darwin core, where does it stop? There's this talk of this taxonomy nomenclature vocabulary. So, where would that take, what would belong in that one and what would not belong in Darwin?
Okay. Any comments specifically from the point of view of barcode of life? Neon?
We actually are here to listen to the developments, because what we're interested in doing is to adopt what the community here uses. So we're not, I don't think we can be as useful in a very substantial way to contributing to the evolution of this, but we want to stay in touch and be in touch so that we know how to adopt these once we're ready to go.
Okay. Day2?
Well, from Day2's perspective, probably the most important use of core will be assisting discovery of relevant information. So it's really, the most critical part from that perspective is that the terms are well defined and used consistently. And when necessary, rather map definitions between, say, content that's marked up with Darwin core tags through EML or GDC or other metadata formats. So essentially, sufficient information to be consistently representing the information that's being used as well.
Okay. Bundestag?
I'm just a guest here, but I would be very interested to have a sort of basis for all our biodiversity-related data exchange. So a core which we could rely on for other data exchanges would have a great value. So it's not just Darwin core for GBIF, but it's Darwin core for all other integration projects.
Okay. Anybody else? Comment?
Speaking for myself more, I suppose. I think that there's what I've been hearing is there's a lot of important ambition towards machine reasoning, automated machine reasoning, which is kind of far out there, and we should always remember that it's there. But I like to think about what we can do that's really easy and foundational, that will, raise all the votes at once. And I think I'm kind of all about identifiers. It'd be nice to shore up our use of identifiers, resolution and management, etc. I put one of those challenges on the challenging points Google Docs, having to do with, hey, let's assign persistent identifiers to each museum and let them append their specimen identifiers, and suddenly we have persistent identifiers for all museum specimens. That would be an interesting and fairly easy low-hanging fruit to accomplish.
Okay.
That's incredibly useful. I mean, from barcode's perspective, that's what we want to achieve, is to see that correspondence between a sequence and an actual specimen in a collection, to give the collections institutions the credit they need for supporting this sort of brave new world of biomonitoring through genomics-based approaches. We've got to make that linkage, and the lack of registry is really inhibitory to that, and it contributes to that pervasive integration of natural history collections, in my opinion.
Okay, so there's from the barcode of life point of view, there's critical importance of being able to attach sequence data to physical specimens wherever possible, unless it's metagenomic or sequence out of gunk, in which it's hard. But as long as it's conceivable it can come from a specimen, do it. Yes?
Yeah, we've been tilting at that wheel for a little bit. I'm not sure what the semantic web part or the ontology stuff is going to contribute to that. We might be getting there, but I'm not sure if this is the right thing. What I want to say is that what we heard with Barry and adopting this sort of ontological approach was that here's where you need to have identifiers. And that's something we can often forget about. So as we start to merge these perspectives, it would be very good for us to have somebody being playing watchdog, saying, did you get the right identifiers and why do you need one here? And be watching out for that view on this world.
Yeah, we happen to have a very generic identifier service that's we do cost recovery on, but it's very simple, very. So anyway, so there are some solutions on the horizon that are actually very close.
And one of the points that was made by the phone here about the importance of having an extensible hierarchical approach so that you can extend concepts and refine concepts is that I recall in a barcode of life conversation, one of the issues was, well, I know what collection the specimen is in, but where it's physically housed is not where it's officially owned. It's sort of on loan. It's at the Smithsonian, but it's really Dan Jansen's collection. And what should the information resource say? Should it give the name of where it's physically located? Should it give the name of the person you have to contact to get permission? How does it resolve that? And one way, of course, is to split the concept of the location of it into it's physically housed here, but it's managed there. And that then becomes a semi-ontological issue of how to deal with location, where location now gets subtle. And if you don't have a formal way of documenting the subtlety, it then turns into chaos.
Well, clearly one term for location is not sufficient to describe
Right.
any biological sample. There's
Right.
all kinds of locations, so we need more specific types of locations.
Right.
Collection location, storage location, like you're saying.
Yeah, and to do that by just, the old-fashioned way of just spinning additional fields, phone number 1, phone number 2, phone number 3, doesn't work. You want to have it structured in there where the semantics are on the link to that definition of location. So it's not what do you suppose this location is, you know what this location is. Yeah. And then you'd like to have the tools that retrieve and manipulate this information, ideally to be able to go to a field that it thought didn't ramify and discover that it ramifies and not throw an error.
That's my view why it makes more sense to have, as Barry suggested, I think Stan was just saying, have unique IDs for every specimen. And then rather than appending the institution code as part of the ID, have another annotation that says home institution, currently housed in, and that way you could still get the same information.
Right.
But you could associate a lot more. You would get, appending the institution ID, I think is just the goal is to create unique IDs that associate something with an institution, so sort of serving two purposes.
Right, and that's a model that's been used on URLs. It's a model that's used on ISBNs and book numbers and that sort of thing, in a lot of things where you say, if I don't have the ability to manage the entire world, but I can manage this upper class of the museums or the publishers or something like that, I can hand out unique IDs to them, and then if each one of them hands out unique IDs inside them, then the concatenation of the two is globally unique. It's a social solution to the inability to manage. But if you go with these gymongous integers that you kick out with a random number generator, the odds of getting a collision on that are so low that you don't have to have central management. It's just that people have a tendency to look at 28 place strings and go, I can't even read it much.
No additional information.
Right. Yeah. So, anybody else we haven't heard from yet? Anything to say? Cindy?
I guess I'm sort of going to echo Norm's desire to have just a clear process with responsibility for maintaining this going forward. And that's just going to be really important, and that includes in part, how do you figure out whether new terms are going to need to be added or which terms need to be mapped to existing terms that are out there.
Mm-hmm.
So, because I am not optimistic enough to believe that we're really going to solve it and have a standardized, ontology that everybody's going to use. There will always be the, upstarts that just aren't aware, and if what they have is useful, then we need to figure out how to bring it in. If it can be back to something we already have, we just need to have, we need to know what the procedure is.
Okay. Andrea, anything?
I think from the standpoint of identify maybe myself only, I would say that echoing again the governance, we need to see how we can divide and conquer. Because, for example, I may not be that interested in the observation part of this ontology, but I may be interested more in the collection side, the physical object, because that's what identify is focusing on. But locations and habitat are things that we do have to be working on, but I think there are people that are more advanced already that I would like to see how we can manage to get that and not have to work on the details of that part. And if things like institutions also are become part of this ontology, it's something that we could also help. I would be willing to give it a try also in using ontologies to describe this.
Okay. That's good. BJ?
I think I also say the same thing, like clear-cut distinction of what subcategories we want to distinguish among all of these biodiversity and ecology domain, and then kind of really understand 5 or 6 or whatever we decide subdomains in which people are going to work, because as everyone around the table has affinity to certain domains, like she's more interested in the collections, I'm more interested in observations or things like that. So getting a clear understanding maybe by tomorrow of these things will be more clear, then we can start communicating more with the like-minded people.
Gil?
Well, from my deep values perspective, and I agree with Andre, I think our challenge is to try to represent a broad range of biodiversity data across domains in a way that, as this database is designed and built, we are in sync with Darwin Core and developing ontologies, and I think we want to build links to taxon objects and specimen objects, collection objects, whatever, in our database. And so, trying to work toward an ontology would be very helpful to us. But in the meantime, we've got things we have to do. And so I think we'll be building at the same time we're learning and trying to stay in sync.
Okay. Alana?
Yeah. I've said a lot already, so I want to let other people speak.
Anybody have anything to say?
I just wanted to mention that I think this is a suggestion that Mark made earlier that I don't think got added to the list, which is trying to compare and contrast some of these ideas with the work that's already been done with Darwin SW, for instance. I think that's a good idea, just because a lot of effort and thought has already gone into some of those projects, and so I don't think we should lose. I don't think we should forget to take a look at what has been done.
Trish?
Only echoing what's said before as far as governance and extending BFO with you said and taking into account groups and also not forgetting about the RSW.
Right. Okay.
I'll add.
Oh, we got some. All right. All right. Over here in the corner.
You want to go first?
Yeah.
They can. Okay. I think the one thing that's very important for the bicycle project, the whole project, is the tracking collections, objects, and their derivatives, which involves both assigning unique identifiers to specific things and tracking their relationships and derivatives across different collections. So you implement this in the semantic web, what comes from what comes from what comes from what. So it hits on a few different things, but I think one big thing that's missing in there is a good notion of types of relations between objects. BFO has some relationship types. I'm not sure if it's entirely appropriate or reasonable to expect that all the different collections are going to be assigning part of, transformation of, derivative of all the different nuanced relationship types, but there's other more generic relationship types that we've been exploring. One's coming from the, we first looked at Dublin Core, we looked at the media ontology relationship types. So I would just propose that there's a few bicycle folks in this room, and I would expect that they would probably want to go to this one, folks. But looking at relationship predicates and their implications.
Capture your thoughts.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, right. That's a more general comment. And over the last couple of days, we've learned about ways of successfully integrating, scientific product, or semantically integrating scientific product, right? And we, our community, and this is obviously going to grow, it's something that's on a roll, and we have this narrowing window of opportunity to contribute to it. And we should at least try and make for ourselves an experiment to sort of recast what we've been doing in a way that makes a broader contribution to the semantic web.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we sort of owe it to ourselves at least to try to do what Barry, Norman and the people have suggested that we do. Even if it's just an experiment. So I'd add to John's first comment. He says a concrete example, but it's more, from my point of view, it would be an experimental example.
Mm-hmm.
So this would be in parallel, I think, to what Steve and Joel are doing, but using this framework as well in parallel.
Okay, Stan?
What did Barry say about when we move over to address the taxonomy part? He said we should be contacting him and linking up with somebody else. I thought, did anybody remember what he said?
I thought he said follow the lead of the people who are really, which Tadwick,
Yeah, no, but there was somebody, I thought there was a group that he said was really invested in names, in scientific names.
I have it here.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not taxonomy,
I can't
but there was a
figure,
group
I have to
that
talk to him to figure out how that would happen.
The ontology for biomedical investigation.
No,
Yes.
The information artifact.
information artifact. Yes. Okay. Anyway, on the taxonomy side, Derek, you said that Judith is obviously very interested in that. I'm involved in a project that is really, really interested in taxonomic names, and if anybody wants to join tomorrow morning, maybe for at least a section of it, I would love to get people who are interested in taxonomic names to convene a little bit and think about the sort of important points going forward.
Okay, so all of those of you who proposed are thinking about the idea of getting a little group together tomorrow. I'm hoping you're capturing this, but also hold that thought so that when tomorrow morning when we really decide to go, let's make sure that we haven't forgotten anything.
Want to be in.
Right. Yeah, I know, there's always a problem of that, I mean, really, if you think about it, if you do this dynamic approach and you come up with 3 great ideas to discuss, how many people want to talk about one and only one? It doesn't happen anyway. Brian, you had anything about that?
Yeah. So this comment comes out kind of from left field and might be off them, but I was reminded of this from Cynthia's comment about, even if we were to advance a piece of technology and some other group who's not aware of this tries to set up something of their own and they discover 2 years later that, hey, maybe they should have come to us. So a way to get around it, and what I'm about to say is fraught with political minefields, and it's very contentious, but I'm going to say anyway. One thing which I've been proposing, including to the semantic guys at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, is that one way to raise awareness to people who might be thinking of setting up their own ways of doing ontologies, or instead of coming to a common framework and starting from there, like in Buffalo, is that when we get to a point where we label the technologies. Just some of you on your machines you have powered by Intel. We should start thinking about labeling any technologies that are driven by semantic technologies with powered by something. I mean, so it gets contentious as to what level should it be labeled at. Should it be powered by Tedwick, powered by Buffalo, powered by Obo, powered by something? So that is the contentious part. But if we as a community we get a chance to discuss at what level, what is the label that you want to put on things out there, at least you can ameliorate some of the difficulties around everybody reinventing stuff, because you're going to redirect some attention to whatever your label says. And that's contentious because, again, everybody will want to say, I want my label on it, or somebody else will say, I want my label on it. So contentious suggestion, but that's one way to, again, get people to appreciate the work that this community is doing and stop reinventing the wheel.
not sure how to capture what you said. I put branding the effort.
Yeah, branding.
Okay.
And you'll notice that recommendation comes from the only person in the meeting wearing a name badge with a brand on it.
I mean, it's a form of chain of source or something. You know, sort of acknowledging that you've built upon something else. Form of a credit of what do you call it? Attribution. A form of attribution.
Yeah, it's partly it's attribution and partly it's the notion, I think, of just that this isn't chaos, that there's common machinery behind a lot of these things and that there's some utility in common machinery. I mean, that's an important mindset to get out there. Chris, you haven't had much to say. Anything to offer?
I've heard, it's been a wonderful discussion. We went back to Aristotle and Plato yesterday. With all due respect, it was a wonderful discussion. I love philosophy as much as everyone else. Of course, the truth about philosophy and the reason why it's so wonderful to be a philosopher is that nobody, it's like being a paleontologist. Nobody knows if you're doing it right.
So if you're a philosophical paleontologist, you really got to lay down.
Right. My interest is in making things happen faster, more efficiently, so we can actually get the much larger job of informing very smart biodiversity, global biodiversity analyses, and then very smart global biodiversity solutions. Whatever it takes, we have to do it faster, quicker, more efficiently, or else we'll be talking about Plato while things go down the handbasket.
And one way to connect that to some of the discussions we had was, on the one hand, we had Barry saying, hey, it's just a list of words and you store it on a disk and disks are cheap and words are easy to create. This is not expensive. And other people saying, yeah, but you got to attach these words to 10 million specimens. That's a lot of work. And if you have to reattach them, that's a lot more work. So one interesting question would be, is there, and I don't know if there's an answer to this question, but is there a way to deploy more of an ontological approach onto specimens in a way that would minimize rework as the ontology evolves? You know, how do you buffer the effort when you're attaching it to specimens in high quantity from the revision process? Because what you really don't want to have to do is go back and touch those individual records more than once. That's the killer. That's the thing that consumes time. Yeah.
We are all systematists, taxonomists, biodiversity scientists, and computer scientists of one flavor or another. So we tend to be anal. We want things to be perfect. We don't want to send things out there as scientists. We don't want to send things out there that are not perfect. But I would challenge you to think that maybe 95% is good enough. Maybe 90% is good enough. Think of all the articles that are published, the books written, the studies published. Are they more than 90% accurate? I doubt it. Are some of them even more than 60% accurate?
Primary literature, not even 50.
So rather than get stuck on 100% perfection, let's do what's doable.
That's a good suggestion. And I don't know how many times I've heard one biological community or another say, what our community needs is our GenBank, our version of GenBank. And what they often have in mind is a very large central repository of formally managed data over which you can compute in an unambiguous manner. And I've found several problems with that. One of them, you know, if you're sort of into that philosophy of science and the notion of Kuhnian paradigms and pre-paradigm science and post-paradigm science and sort of fill-in-the-blank science within a paradigm, generating DNA sequences is the classic example of fill-in-the-blank science inside a paradigm. That we know what the chemical structure of DNA is, we're just collecting instances of it. It's just a catalog of the same data type over and over and over again. That's the easiest possible class of scientific information to database and catalog. Okay? If you want to think about what's hard, imagine building a database about evidence regarding the chemical structure of the gene pre-1950. It's just a boatload of phenomenology. Okay, and much of it contradictory. So in almost any other area of science, it has more in common with collecting data relevant to the chemical structure of the DNA in 1950 than it does in what's going on here. Secondly, there is nothing I see in the newspapers here or in Europe or anywhere else that says that we can expect a giant spike in government support for information infrastructure for science over the next decade. Okay? If we can hold steady with funding, we should be very, very happy. And I am personally ready to predict that it is much more likely that within 10 years the sequence databases will start to fail because they can't keep up with the data volume than it is that major spending is going to be made on a biodiversity database. So there's where this notion of what's good enough is a very, very important issue. How do we build systems that will in fact continue to deliver useful value, to deliver genuine utility, not perfection, but genuine utility into the indefinite future, despite the fact that funding at best is going to be flat, and and carry us through to where someday it goes up, and maybe carry us through to where it works despite imperfections. I mean, one of the things that I think is really interesting is if you look at the amount of information you can suck out of the consumer infosphere. Go mine Flickr pictures and this sort of thing. There's no formal structure to that. There's just so much of it. And with the right algorithms, it's so easy to get to that there's value in it, even though it's way from perfect. Yeah.
I think a good practice to start with a not so good solution is to have some solution for extending and correcting the not so good solution.
Yep.
If I'm locking myself in a bad solution, that's bad.
Right, locking yourself in a bad solution forever is definitely bad. And that then gets into this notion of extensibility and that you're constantly painting the bridge. That the most important aspect, I mean, if you look at information technology, this is one of my favorite stories. If you look at information technology over the last 40 or 50 years and you say, what aspect of it has been the most robust? I would argue it's TCP/IP networking. That has been going on for decade after decade after decade. It continues to work. It continues to deliver value. You can hook Wi-Fi into it trivially easily. Wi-Fi wasn't even a concept when TCP/IP networking was invented, and yet you can plug Wi-Fi into it. And one of the questions is, well, why is TCP/IP so resilient? And packet switch networking has sort of two origins, one in Europe where it was driven by the desire to support time sharing on big computers, but in the US, the model for TCP/IP networking was driven out of the RAND Corporation and a desire to devise a communication network that could function at least in a rudimentary way during a nuclear war. Okay? And if you design an information system that is intended to function when Chicago goes up in a puff of smoke, it handles the advent of Wi-Fi in a fairly straightforward manner. So it was designed. I mean, if you look at the protocols, we got talking about MAC addresses, but one of the reasons that duplicate MAC addresses aren't a huge problem, even if they do occur, is because MAC addresses are only useful on a local network. They get bound to an IP address locally with ARP and RARP protocols. That's the only place they mean anything is on a local network. So to have a MAC address collision be a problem, the two identical addresses have to be on the same network. If they're not on the same local network, it doesn't matter. Because ARP and RARP says I got this abstract IP address that goes to a local network, and the local network maps it in real time to the MAC address. And that's why you can change a MAC card out on a computer, and it comes up and it gets reassigned in the ARP and RARP protocols, and it gets redirected to it. It is designed to be real-time correcting. It was designed, it's one of the few IT systems and protocols that was designed from the ground up with its primary goal of accommodating change. So yes, if you build IT systems where an absolutely central requirement is the ability to accommodate arbitrary change, you tend to have one that lasts for a long time. And if it tries to optimize something other than change, it tends to break when the need for change comes around. That's my little speech. Yeah?
A couple things. So first of all, having done a couple of these good enough solutions, I can tell you that when you do that, when you actually do that, come with a strong backbone. Because, you do it, and you do get benefit, and a whole lot of people say thank you very much, and boy, this is great, but you'll also have to endure this is crap, this is ridiculous, this doesn't, there are always the isolated few who fall into the 20% part of your suboptimum, that 20% will be, not friendly to you, so you just accept that and satisfy yourself.
And if you're going for a good enough solution, it's really, really important to know the rest of the predicate. Good enough for what?
Yeah.
Okay.
So my second thing is Joel, so you got, I want to point out that one of the things that was a go-to for this meeting was to produce a list of issues, or actually I think use cases, and to go to the question of why would we do, or what's broken, or why should we do something, or if we have to choose good enough, you know, what's the parameter that we would use to assess whether this is good enough or that's not, or what's the most useful or least useful. Those use cases are an important contributor to answering those questions. Because if things are useful to the community, then when somebody says, what's the use case that we need to solve, those should come out instant. I mean, there shouldn't be a lot of debate, there shouldn't be, you know, somebody should be able to say, well, absolutely, I have to have, you know, we have to serve whatever, this particular use or this particular need. So pulling out these use cases that we consider to be the really predominant ones in the community, I think serves a really useful purpose, if not for contributing to the ontology construction, but to this sort of testing of what should we do, you know, what's the important thing, you know, if we have to choose which thing to do first, and, you know, what do we need to get out and get done now versus later. I think that's an important part of it.
Yeah, and that business of knowing what you in fact are trying to do is so important. Again, back to TCP/IP networking, when it was first suggested, the representatives of the telco industry pointed out how stunningly inefficient it was to have all of this overhead to move a message around. When you got circuit switch networks, you just click the circuits in place and bam, you got a call. And you don't have 50% of your bits going to routing. But the response to that was, right, we're not trying to be efficient, we're trying to be robust, and robustness involves redundancy. So this is a feature, not a bug, so go away with your criticism about efficiency. Yeah, it's really important to know what you're trying to do, and for whom.
On the good enough solution, I have to say this stuff that Chuck said, that we should emphasise that good enough is an interim solution. Because we have people working on projects where they're trying to do it properly. They're very, very long-term projects. And then you have a good enough solution come along, and half the world says, well, oh, it's good enough. You know, why do we have to fund that really happening? So as long as everyone knows that we have an interim solution so that we can start working immediately.
Right.
But we're working till this, like, has to be the long-term goal, most definitely. So you just have to be careful.
Well, we also want to be careful that we don't fall into the trap, the sort of, you know, current self-esteem thing where, you know, every kid in the league gets a trophy and every team gets a trophy and everybody's a winner and nobody's a loser sort of thing. Adequate is a great state, right? If you look up the definition of adequate, it means fully capable of accomplishing a goal. That's bad. You know, and most people would say, you know, use perfectionist as a criticism, not as a genuine goal you're going for. Also, I remember in the early days of the genome program, we'd go around and visit different labs and ask how their informatics was going. I remember one of them in particular said, well, one lesson we had was don't recruit your IT people from the computer science department. You give them a problem and they go off and come back in 4 days and say, I've solved it. And you say, what's the solution? They said, I've proved it's NP complete. Give me another one. And they said, no, get rid of the CS guys and hire engineers. Because engineers have a notion of what's the task, what are my constraints, what's good enough, what's sufficient, and they deliver sufficiency within budget, within the constraints, and on time. That's why you want engineers in there. And what we're talking about here is not solving an academic problem where the one true answer is what we're after. We're trying to devise infrastructure that supports biodiversity information systems, collections management, and that stuff, and allows the infrastructure not to be the rate limiting step. And I firmly believe that when I was at the Hutch, the guy ran the facilities department liked the slogan, world-class facilities for world-class research. And my attitude was, we don't want to have a world-class IT department. Because if we are a world-class IT department in a world of finite money, that means we had to give up some cancer research in order to have the best IT department on earth. And what we want to have is cancer research that is not limited by its IT resources. It's facilitated and supported by it. It's not the rate limiting step. Step is it's good enough and it consumes so many resources, you don't have the resources to accomplish the primary mission. So infrastructure always has to strive for adequacy, which a lot of people think is a contradiction, but it isn't, because a truly optimal infrastructure system delivers everything that's needed and doesn't waste resources on excess capacity. That's the key to infrastructure. So good enough is not, I mean, people like to say, well, I have to settle for something that's good enough. That's not what I'm talking about when I say good enough. It's not something you settle for because you really need something better. It's what's needed to accomplish your goals without taking resources away from the goals.
Going back to what we started with at the beginning of the session,
yeah,
which was we wanted to figure out what are the breakout groups. Sounded like that people agreed with that idea, and
yes.
We also wanted to perhaps get groups together tonight as well.
I just suggested that if there are some of these ideas of going forward tomorrow that might benefit from an hour or two of brainstorming tonight, I would suggest that.
Do it over barbecue, I'll tell you.
Well, so I was just where I was going with this is if we had really good clarity before we left on what are the topics and what are the groups that are discussing those topics, and you have the suggestion of the posted.
But I don't know that we need it. We've only had about 4, I think, or 5 suggestions.
Well, and so now what I did is I was taking notes here, and I probably missed a lot of stuff, but what I started to do was I started highlighting the topics that sounded like there was some kind of willingness to get together and actually do something around them. So I highlighted them in yellow. The first one is starting with John's.
Is that bigger?
Yeah, I think so. It's going to be a bit channel. Is that good? So I started with John's here, which is the concrete example of some bigger still. You know, I pasted that. You could either go to ReadyTalk and look at it there, or you can open up the Google Doc itself.
Oh, it's in there?
You know, here, actually, let me go up.
Yeah, and here's a nice mnemonic identifier up here too that's globally unique and
well,
absolutely unintelligible.
There's the shortened one.
There's the shortened one, yeah.
So I'll blow that up. And so anybody who really wants to read this can go to bit.ly/J, lowercase z, w, and I can't tell if that's 0, capital E9. And I see people appearing on the Google Doc now. 10 viewers. Yeah, it's going up now. It's good. Okay. Now I can shrink this again and actually see something. Okay, so John's proposal. I don't know, Joel, you also had brought up someone had brought up the situating Darwin core within BUFO, and I don't know if that's the same one as John's or it's a different one. But there was discussion of creating an OWL model in Protégé of what Barry had written up on the board.
I think those two should be, I mean, like Herbert said, that's trivial. It'll take 10 minutes to do that once we can find the latest version of BUFO. And then you could do one branch, like John suggested, within that. Those two could be combined fairly. As long as we agree not to argue too much about putting in what Barry said.
So are you suggesting that they can be combined?
They can be combined, yes.
In a sense, it's perfect because Barry had only suggested a subset anyway.
Okay, so I'm going to
deal with identification and taxonomy.
Are there dependencies between those two things anyway?
Are there dependencies?
But that you need the OWL thing to do what you want to do. So.
Okay. There's the next topic was Norman had suggested the governance structure, which got echoed a bunch of times around the room. And sounded like they were all part of just general governance structure, unless there is a reason to split out any different types of governance structures.
Well, can I ask the question, is there anybody who can say there's this obvious huge downside to embedding this in the OVO foundry?
An obvious downside to embedding it in the OVO foundry.
I can tell you not a downside, but a potential limitation is that what you might want to do eventually is embed this in a larger, as Barry's suggesting, a larger biodiversity foundry, a biodiversity ontology foundry that might become, that could potentially, that could all be part of the OVO foundry, but we'd have to discuss that with them whether or not that's something they would want to encompass. So it might limit the extensibility, but certainly there's no reason it can't follow OVO foundry principles to begin with, and then eventually decide should it live in the OVO, should all these biodiversity ontologies be part of the OVO foundry? Or should
Well,
there
it's
be a
not
sort of
biomedical.
an
He
overlapping
kind of-
set of ovofoundry ontologies and biodiversity ontologies?
Right, I mean, he kind of suggested the whole sort of vision for oboe is not to be just biomedical, but biological.
No, it could very well go,
Biodiversity
it
is,
could very
you
well
know,
go in
within
there.
that domain.
Yeah, yeah.
And just in trying to figure out, when you talk about governance and stuff, there's already a lot of potential structures that we can merge with. Ultimately, it's not a closed game. We want it to be open and crowdsource and get more and more participation in. You just have to find a home to link it to. And it seems like GSC has actually got some funding to hold meetings and move forward in that respect, so that's why I asked the question. If we're looking for a framework within which to operate, and many people who are part of this group are part of the GSC consortium anyway, and they have a biodiversity working group too, why not?
There's no reason there couldn't be some sort of set which is the intersection of GSC and ovofoundry, right? That could be some potential governance.
Well, and like I said, this workshop is funded by the RCN for GSC project, and Norman's the chair of the biodiversity committee for GSC, and it's hooked up with John at the last Tadwig meeting proposed a biodiversity working group inside Tadwig to then be connected up with this. So the goal is to hold them together. Anything that comes out of this meeting is not orthogonal to those other efforts. And I do think that, one of the drums that Barry pounded a lot was the idea that, if you don't use the right foundation classes, you can go forward, but you will die, basically, was it, or you're going to run into major problems. And, while that sounds a little religious, anybody who's built any kind of either object-oriented, any kind of hierarchical system knows that if you don't get your base classes right, you spend a lot of time implementing something and then decide you got to change foundational classes. It's huge work. And so trying to build any new approach anchored into this super abstract set of foundation classes in BFO means that you'll spend more time on your own root classes than you would otherwise, because you'll be trying to connect it up in there. And that means you'll be less likely to create silliness issues.
That's true, but that's not... There's more benefit in that. I mean, speaking from the Envo side, when we're starting with something like biome, which is very problematic, to say the least, and a bit fuzzy across different communities, particularly the marine community versus the terrestrial community. There are different factors, etc. Starting from something as abstract as BFO was actually helpful, because you can formulate it in such a way that would allow a framework for those communities to put their own differentia forward, to define their own biome classes in a way which an ecologist or a biologist is familiar enough with to use in a functional way, in a practical way, but at the same time is aligned to some sort of shared meaning, some sort of shared conceptualization of what the thing means in the first place. And it helps from that side to organize things. And the path for all of the other terms, and there are a lot of them in ENVO, the way to reorganize them and restructure them is a lot clearer because of that. At least this is my impression at this stage. It might change.
Certainly the base class, you need to get the base classes right. That's not the same thing as saying that every domain should have the same base classes,
right,
and that there should be an upper ontology. And Barry's first slide was about the history of the semantic web, and I'm not sure I see that history the same way that he does. He said, well, all this vision, and then it collapsed because there was no upper ontological agreement. But in fact, the first 5 years of the semantic web were all about upper ontologies, and almost any talk he went to on the semantic web started with electron ontology and presentation of different alternatives. There was the IEEE upper ontology, there were a number of them, then they emerged into Sumo. And it was, and it didn't achieve its vision. And then Web 2.0 exploded, and people started talking about the lowercase semantic web, and then linked data came along. And it's certainly true that there's a general sense that there needs to be some ontological structure on top of linked data. It's not unanimous, but there's sort of a feeling in the community. I mean, is everybody in the room persuaded that Darwin Core should inherit from BFO?
Yes. Any comments on that to answer the question before we go on? Anybody? What was your question? Positive?
My question is
who has doubts?
Who's convinced that Darwin Core should inherit from BFO?
I think it's a good, qualified yes. Why not? The question, I think, the way you want to put it is, do I have any doubts that we could fall on our face, or that there's a more appropriate one, or, you know,
Well,
and I don't know.
Let me say, put it this way, what if we turn out, 8 use cases have been put up on John's challenge page? What if it turns out that Darwin SW plus AOD addresses all of them?
To give you an answer. When we decided to establish a thesaurus for €80, we decided to use COS-ADF. No matter whether there is a better thesaurus structure that we can rely on, it's a standardized, multiple used standard. And what I know when I use anything which is defined within RDF, I have an expandability, so that I don't lock myself in a bad solution. And I think it would be the same if I just take some upper ontology. No one can hinder me if later on find that this upper ontology was not the best one, that we would have a better one, to change the upper ontology. It's a painful process, of course, but it is not an undoable process. My English is very bad, but I hope I could explain what I think after.
I think these are two thoughts, what I was going to say and what in responding to this. I think the sketch that we got out of Barry is starting to become intimidatingly complicated. It makes me worry about presenting complicated things to people who are not interested in all of this complexity. And so we need to have, presentations that sort of filter down to the more appropriate kinds of, those pathways to applicable things. But I may have drunk the Kool-Aid, but if this set of the foundation potentially gives us description, logic, and reasoning more so than Darwin SW and AOD do, then there's some motivation to say, well, why not be paying attention to both of these things? Those use cases and being able to satisfy them, being driven by that, but also trying to do it with these this foundation. Is there a problem? Are these mutually exclusive?
Let's ask the reverse of your question, Joel. Who here has doubts at the significant level about anchoring Darwin Core in BFO?
What about reservations?
Reservations, if this were a court of law, would you be reluctant to convict because of your doubts?
Yeah, I mean, let me say, maybe reservation. I mean, look, we spun on wheels for years, right? And if we want to spend 6 months seeing what we can do with BFO, well, it's not going to kill anybody. But
well, I could, using your analogy, I could say, well, I've now heard the prosecution's case. Time for the defense.
Okay.
So along the line, is there something wrong with this? Who knows? We haven't, in a day and a half, it's kind of hard to say.
Yeah, I mean,
I've heard everything.
Right. Yep.
It's something
Sorry.
I've been thinking about for the last 2 days. I don't know if it impacts us or not, but it seems to me that there's a qualitative difference between biomedical ontology, building biomedical ontologies and building biological ontologies. And that qualitative difference has to do with having to and wanting to. I mean, I think we want to, but if you look at biomedical, there are legal constraints and being sued constraints and medical records transfer constraints across not just the United States, but the world that hospitals have to live with, and hospitals want to do. Every hospital wants to do the same thing, the same way, so that medical records can be transferred. Physicians want to do that. Pharmaceuticals want it that way. So it just seems like the challenge that we're up against is, we want to do this, and we have a much broader base, I think, to do it with. If you look at biomedical, you're really talking about a fairly confined, constrained group, I think, versus biological databases. And maybe I'm wrong about that.
I would argue against that, just having worked in the biomedical field. I think that realm has more people and more money, more resources that throw at it. I think in our case, Because you're working with multiple species and trying to attach all these data to vast number of species all over the entire Earth in multiple environments, like it's just
And multiple,
it's a little mind-numbing.
multiple ontologies. I mean,
It's a lot to deal with, and I think that's sort of the scale is a huge challenge. Just back to the original question, I think that what's been presented in the last 2 days is interesting, and it makes a lot of sense to me. I think working through examples helps, because I don't think sitting through a day and a half lecture is going to concrete anything, and my mind without actually working with some.
Okay, so you support the original suggestion, which was let's test drive some stuff.
Check it out, yeah.
Okay.
So, one thing I have is a question. So that's the first. So, those people who are familiar and have used hands-on some of the OBO ontologies for doing either annotation or integration, is there anybody here that's actually really use this in practice?
No, we work with lots of people, but, yeah, especially players.
I'm sorry, just what?
So for those OBO, so those.
I mean, I know lots of people, I haven't done it myself, but I know how lots of people do it, so.
So for those people, so how critical was the BFO for that integration or annotation? So that's my first question.
It's becoming ever more critical as we want to work. We have been able for some time now to make very simple annotations. Gene XYZ is expressed in the phloem cell. Gene XYZ participates in phloem cell formation. When you want to actually start to make more complex associations that involve multiple ontologies, it becomes very crucial that those ontologies are compatible and BFO provides that compatibility.
Yeah, so.
How does it provide? So I don't really understand how it does that.
So that you know, so say you want to describe.
I mean, I know this is a continuum.
Yeah, so if you want to describe something, if you want to describe, I can't flow something, like a leaf that's green, right? You have to take leaf and you have to take green. And you have to know that green is I believe, a generically dependent continuant, and that leaf is a material entity. And if those two things aren't those two things, then it's kind of, then when you're putting them together, it doesn't make the same kind of sense. And you have to have some faith.
I don't understand how that helps with the actually annotating or integrating the data.
Really? That isn't intuitively obvious?
No.
Yeah, so you think that we could take the English dictionary, the American dictionary, the French dictionary, and start mixing words and get intelligible sentences?
I think that's a different issue.
So if I then have this big database.
Put that in your body.
I don't think the BFO actually gives you.
Sounds like Ezra
what you're
Pound's
implying.
If I get this big database or the semantic web, and I want to search the semantic web for every green leaf, if I want to search for, I can search for everything that's green, everything that's a leaf, and everything that's a green leaf. And if those things aren't logically defined, I'm going to get responses that don't make sense. They don't match the query that I'm trying to get.
Sean, that was what you said was the reason why we drew back to the SORI instead of ontologies. We just wanted to have simple structures where we can find items easily, fast, and direct. And now we have the problem that those items are related to more relationships than just a Thesaurus hierarchy, and we would be glad if we could establish relations. On the other hand, we are very happy to have used a standard for those for this Thesaurus hierarchy.
Well, so I think having a hierarchy is really important. So knowing that red is a color or green is a color, or that I have a certain type of a green color and
But if you
another
don't
type
have,
of
but
a
you have
green
to know
color.
but you also have to know what a color is.
Do I?
Yeah, I think.
And how does BFO help with that?
It
Does
tells
tell
you
me
the
what color
difference
it is?
between what the color is a color a wavelength that you've measured, is the color the word that describes the color, is the color the quality that he hears in something.
So he didn't show any of that.
Actually, he did. That was exactly what he talked about in avoiding the use, mention, confusion. And don't confuse the name of an object for an object.
Well, those are some principles, but then
But that's the basic principle that
I mean,
BFO
there's
is trying
some
to
great
build.
examples in Darwin Core that say I don't
He
know
didn't
if
show
it's
the
relevant,
example.
but I think I've close the name, but that they're totally confusing. Like it says that a genus is the name of a genus. The name of the genus is what you should put in that field. It's not what a genus is, right? So that.
Well, so one question is, if you just have an ontology that follows these principles, that sounds like it's independent of BFO to me. As long as you follow the principles, it doesn't necessarily have to tie into the whole BFO.
You don't have to have the BFO in your ontology. It doesn't, like, the BFO is not in the plant ontology, but it just so happens that the two major branches of the plant ontology conform to two classes of the BFO.
It will also help with ontology integration or in whatever way you want to reuse terms. And I know your term reuse is, from
I mean, I have some doubts about
yes.
the utility.
Chuck's trying to make a point here.
When you're trying to merge.
This is interesting. I thought I was going to get out of this meeting without making my usual statement that I seem to make in every meeting. So.
You didn't make it, huh? All right.
And now here it is. Before I can get out of the room, I'm going to make the statement. All right. So we have some ample evidence in this community, and not in this particular ontology issue, but on in other attempts to try to categorize our data of thorough, deep, complete, as far as we could take it, and come up with what, there it is. And then you know what? That winds up being, then there's like, these many people say, yeah, boy, that's great, we'll use it. And then these many people say, I can't follow that. That's the most complicated thing. Forget that. I'm moving on. I'll do my own thing. Because you just left me in the dust. You've made it so abstract. I don't have the time to study the papers that it's going to take for me to catch up with you, and what BFO, what continuance, what, and so you run the risk in some of these pursuits that you may go too far, or you just have to be careful. You have to really be careful in what your expectations are. So I've always I went up giving this thing about simple versus complex. So here it is again.
And that's an important point, but I want to throw out some stuff again. This is my old fart with all the old history stuff to share. GenBank was originally a collection of text files. Okay, every GenBank entry was just a text file. They called it a flat file, but actually it wasn't a flat file, it was just text. And when the proposal was for Los Alamos to start using a relational database, the main whine out of the community was, I don't understand relational databases, they're too complex. And it took a lot of vision to go ahead and formalize it. And the trick is that, at least I'm a great believer in this, that the only path to genuine simplicity from a user's point of view is a great deal of highly encapsulated complexity. Okay? It's a whole lot easier to write a program inside DOS 3.3 than it is in the Mac OS. Okay? Because the Mac OS is simple to use, complex to program, because it encapsulates all that complexity so that it looks simple to the user. In a simple system like DOS, the complexity flows through to the user, so you get a C prompt and you have to figure out what's going on. So the trick here is to be guided by these critically important use cases and say, what does a simple solution to that look like? How much complexity do we need to have to make it simple from the user's point of view once we've encapsulated it? And if you come up with a system where if anybody wants to use this, they have to understand these, what are they, existentially quantified continuant, something like that, I don't know. No, if an end user has to understand that, this thing is going to fail hard. But if you can encapsulate that where third-party people can take their knowledge of it and help develop widgets that make this really simple for end users, that's the trick. Norman, I think, and Stan, or Stan and Norman?
So, yeah, so I'll go back to what you said also earlier about the base class stuff. Is like, well, if we go forward with this, we don't have to invent it ourselves. And when Tadwig did try to invent its base, I didn't like that. That was also getting me just like, what they put down on paper in the first Tadwig ontology and the base class stuff and naming conventions and all kinds of other things had me recoiling. I was not ready to go follow that charge. We do need a way up, right? So we've all been, many of us have been through since the early 90s, the modeling, the methodologies, and we've gone from ER to EER to object to UML to XML to it goes on and on and on. So now we've got this one, and I'm like the notion of having some rationale and some philosophy and even the promise of description, logic, reasoning over the way we're going to ratchet up and do our assembly. You know, so I've come full circle with really, really hating data dictionaries in 1990, that they were the root of all evil and isn't that the stupidest thing ever, to having the Darwin core. You know, and now I'm ready to go back and start assembling again, and I think this is a good way forward. But having said that, I would definitely like to be informed about what's the difference between BFO and Sumo and Dolce. So looking forward to it. If anybody's got any tutorials to point us to on that.
And I didn't mean to be short with you, Chuck, on that, but way back when I served as manager of the Stanford football team, and you know, in practice, you got all these tires on the field, and guys are doing stutter steps and running through the tires, and you can imagine a player saying, I don't believe I've ever seen a game where there are these abandoned tires on the field, so why am I wasting my time running through tires? And the reason you're wasting your time running through tires is because on the field there is a high premium for being able to maintain control of your center of gravity while doing weird things with your feet. And so that's why you run through the tires during practice. And I think that I have to admit, I came into this, you know, kind of deeply suspicious of some of the level of abstraction at the very top level of these ontologies. It felt like, geez, you turn a bunch of philosophers loose and they can build anything out of anything. And yet, when you look at it in the sense that just like you got to be able to maintain your center of gravity while you're doing weird things with your feet if you're going to play football well, you have to get your base classes right if you're going to build a system, an information system, right. And if you're forced to connect those to something that somebody spent a lot of time worrying about with a lot of subtlety, if you're forced to connect into that through some kind of layer, that forces a level of clarification. And if you come to the realization, you want to argue that the BFO classes are wrong, that you got better insights than them, well, maybe you do. Smart money says you probably don't, but maybe you do, and that would be a good thing to share with the rest of the community too. But I think it's more like running through tires. It's not something that's inherently good in itself. It just forces you to behave in a way that takes you to a better place. And Greg's going to tell me why I'm wrong.
No,
all right.
I would never do that.
Well, I thought we were doing a little dichotomy.
No, I was just going to say it's not either or either or, depending on what. It's a, you know, if for persistence purposes, we use a relational database to store this stuff. So to do that, we use an entity relationship model to make that work. We're building user interfaces using object-oriented technologies, so that requires us to have a domain model. You know, built very much like the Tablet domain model, class, base class, etc., etc. But now more and more, we're also being asked to deliver information to the semantic web, or it's linked open data. And that's going to require us to model things in a way that actually makes that possible, and for us to do it right, you know, or as best we possibly can. So in my group, we have all of these models, and there's probably a few others. You know. We use XML schemas, which look completely different too. You know, we use document structures where they're all models for, you know, how we store and capture and represent our data. You know, we have to do them all.
So I feel like we've heard a lot of good arguments for why using BFO would be a good strategy, but some people indicated they do have strong reservations about that. Would anybody be willing to share what those reservations are? I'm curious.
So my reservations are that I heard a lot about BFO the past couple of days. It sounds really intriguing, potentially attractive. I recently attended an EarthCube charrette on geosemantics. I recently attended a 2-day vocabulary camp on geosemantics. I heard the mention of BFO exactly 0 times at both of those efforts. So, before making a decision about biodiversity community committing to this particular upper ontology, where we're not just getting, you know, the notion of continuance and occurrence and this notion of quality embedded as a generically dependent continuant, and the notion of object, you know, embedded under material continuance, I think we should step back and say this sounds very appealing, but are there some other offers, sort of like what you were saying, Stan, whether it's Sumo, that gives us, you know, equal value? And to recognize that there are other big groups in the earth and environmental sciences who are also struggling with how to build ontologies, and they're not necessarily jumping right into BAFO yet. Maybe ultimately they will, and maybe that would be good. I know Barry would.
There's one answer to your question.
This might be naive, and we might have actually talked about it a little bit, but I am concerned about how Darwin Core would work into the occurrent and continuant sort of framework, and that's one of those just kind of fundamental epistemological or potential differences. The way that our data is already might be fundamentally different. I'm not convinced that that's actually the case yet, but we do need to do the map. I mean, we've talked about this. We do need to do that mapping and see what happens when we try to get things into that framework.
Okay.
I just had a real quick question. What upper levels are they discussing at those other meetings, or?
They are actually not very concerned with upper levels. They're much more concerned with from observations and measurements where you are actually engaging with the data up until to the mid-levels, which is where the scientists are querying on topical thematic issues within their domain. And so this notion of whether it's a continuant or an occurrent or a generically dependent one, they're not worried about.
But they might be doing it unconsciously. They might be classifying. One would hope that they're classifying things consistently. And whether or not they match exactly
So
the
don't
data,
I'm
they
not
should
saying
be
that
matching.
I'm not rejecting BAFO. I'm just saying that at this particular meeting, I would have reservations about endorsing it. Yeah, let's go with it. I think it's worth serious.
Okay.
I think
So
we
no,
understand.
So quickly, we were talking about governance things. I have very high confidence that Tadwig represents at least a significant portion of the biodiversity community. Doesn't represent the ecological side very well, but the taxonomic side it does very well. It has very strong international collaboration, blah, blah, blah. I'm also convinced that the oboe stuff has got some very serious weight behind it, and it's strongly biological, strongly molecular, whatever. We need to integrate the thing that we got from GSE is all good.
In this case, weight is something good.
And the only
weight is not inertia. Weight is
yes. I mean, some serious user commitment, And then, but the one thing that where biodiversity stuff may do more so than the oboe does is with the spatial. And so we need to be looking at that domain very well, and it's kind of our responsibility to interface between those two.
Yeah, and that with the RCN for GSC thing, the next obvious step is connecting to georeferencing standards. I mean, it just screams for it,
Doing taxonomy that.
I think that Barry gave us a lot of really interesting stuff. He made some very nice, valid criticisms, especially this afternoon. Things that could be, improving definitions, etc. The whole knowing about the traps we could fall into is really important. Having said that, I think it's a non-starter. I mean, just the sociology of this group alone, despite, forget the learning curve for users and how many you might scare off. There was so much, we sense the pushback here and confusion. I think that we collectively don't really understand what we were just told. Therefore, how could we agree to it? I think it's worth keeping in our sights. Our sights.
Well, I don't think I've heard anybody in this room suggest that done deal, BFO, move forward, commitment for the next decade. The question is more on the continuum of it's interesting, but the first thing we need to do is look elsewhere, or it's interesting enough that the first thing we need to do is some test driving to see if it stays interesting after a little bit of poking at it. But I haven't heard a call for an outright rejection, nor have I heard a call for an outright acceptance. It's more, how much effort is it worth putting into fiddling with it? With a good suggestion here, and especially with the georeferencing, a really critical thing is if you know the other communities that you are likely to want to connect to in the future, and if you're concerned with extensibility and avoiding do-over, you want to get a notion of how they're anchoring things. And are you going to pick a horse that won't work with their horse?
Just general comment from this side, just going back to the conversation and also just from our perspective. A mental model that I sort of keep when I think about this is that things like upper-level ontologies like BFO or BUFO, they kind of establish naive physics, a kind of very simple way of expressing the world to, say, machine agents or something like that, which then lets things or like different agents talk to each other from different ontologies, different domains. Now, with ENVO, I mean, it will be anchored in BFO, but I really doubt that the end user is even going to feel that. They're not going to know that unless they're trying to do something more complex, where they're trying to bridge ontologies, say. they may not necessarily feel it then, but if they wanted to really get into the guts of it, then one would expect that they would need to familiarize themselves with the machine behind it, the machinery behind it, rather. So, like, we use the Envo annotations. I've done this with master students in the field for their samples here in Bremen or Zilt, our sampling site, and they don't feel it. They don't worry about what a continuant is. It's very domain-centric for them, but it's plugged in on this. It's rooted. It's plugged into an ontology which gives it a naive physics to express what is the world in a kind of informatics sense, and that's the sort of thing that helps me put these things together.
Just pick up and join a number of points and to add a bit of logic to it, and I think probably slightly echo what you just said, Bob, actually, because if you consider this tripartite relationship of biodiversity informaticians and the geospatial community and, of course, the genomics community as well, we're kind of overly represented here by two of those groups. And from Mark, what you were saying as well, the geospatial community don't tend to care too much about these upper level ontologies. But in terms of what Chris was saying earlier on as well, is that we're trying to promote efficiencies, make things work a bit faster, see if we can get places a little bit faster. And I think from what I've heard from the skeptics is that we could suck it and see, and what have we got to lose? There wouldn't be too much overhead. But I think certainly from working on the different relationships between this tripartite relationship, as I said, certainly there is the potential for greater efficiencies between at least our two communities. And there doesn't seem to be too much detriment between working between the geospatial and the genomic and the biodiversity and the geospatial, if we were to consider all those relationships. So there might be just, I'm just being devil's advocate in a way, but there might be a way to just say, suck it and see for a little while, see if there's anything that works, anything that we can say has added any benefits.
Okay, so you are endorsing the proposals that have come out over here of test driving in a small, tractable manner the application of some of these ideas to the information that we've got, which in a sense is then the key test is, does the complexity look like it's going to explode, especially into the abstract layers that biologists aren't interested to, or does it look like that can be layered off and encapsulated and move on quickly into the stuff that is of interest to the collections managers? Yeah. Okay.
Just back to my meeting organizer hat and trying to organize.
And you're looking at the clock?
I'm looking at the clock. We're almost at 5:30. And we still wanted to go through the complete list of the breakout.
Yes, you were trying to do that and you got sidetracked. So
we got sidetracked, yes. So there was the governance structures.
Right.
And then the next one down is I presented the bicycle case, which is collections objects, derivatives. I'm looking at relationship predicates. Stan had suggested the taxonomic names. I'm looking at the information artifact ontology. I put on another item there, which is wrap up from this meeting. Is we want to have a website for this meeting. Where would that website live? What things we want to put on that website? What are the short-term wrap-up things, immediate things we need to see from this meeting? There's a couple other things I just added here. Maybe we just go through the list and make sure there aren't things that we don't want to, or maybe we do or don't want to spend more time on at this meeting. One is, there was a mention of the test database, putting together, I think you mentioned it, Mark, putting together a test bed database. Someone's editing there. Is that something we want to do here, put together that database? What would that look like? Folks have it. Is there anybody willing to say, yes, I want to do that, and I want to organize people around me to help get that done now? Can we do it quickly? Tripify everybody? Can we do something like that? No. Well,
just need it down co-provider.
It might be possible to
sit down co-provider.
Well, do you want them in triples? I mean, that's, well, I think that was the suggestion. Okay. Well, actually, we could do.
It's not just having the corpus of data. It's having the types of semantic capabilities, insights into that corpus that you could potentially derive using these different proposals.
Well, we could, I mean, no one's speaking up for it right now, saying they want to spearhead that, so let's.
I mean, it's something that, I don't know if it can be done tomorrow morning, but if people have, if people have data, I mean, that's something I'm very interested in, and it's something we talked about in New Orleans. I mean, that's in the purview of the Cadre group, I think. So, I mean, I'd hate for that to sort of be dropped from our agenda.
Oh, we're not. Well,
Just 'cause
we're just talking about
this one.
breakout groups for tomorrow, so it's not the end of everything. Let's see, what was the other one here? We had a discussion about, was there any other actionable items coming out of our discussion about, do we really think it's going to help to put Darwin Core into BOFO? And I'm guessing that question is part of both governance structure and
test drive.
And in the first topic.
I think the important point to just
right now? I'm sorry, I can't really see. How many
Yeah, it's hard to see all of them at once. Let's see. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Well, 4.5. I guess now would be the time, if you had something that you wanted to, I think your screen froze here. Oh, identifiers and resolution management. That was, did you want to do anything else with that, John?
I'd be happy to participate and lead and breakout group on that.
You know what?
Okay, so John's going to lead the breakout group on identifiers.
John? I would lead a breakout group on loading data into one of the experimental, one of the sandbox triple stores. And anybody who wants to work with me will just, we could try to quickly represent data, going to Darwin SW, just pick one possibility, or, plain Darwin Core, it's easier.
So you're volunteering to lead the testbed database formation?
Yeah,
There you go.
and if the BOFO version, if BWC BFO, becomes available, then we could also load that data into the sandbox. Load data in that representation into the sandbox.
Okay, so we'll summarize these. We'll put, you want to lead the first one. This is the working with Darwin Core and BUFO. Darwin Core / BUFO. And we can put Visurik. And then the governance. I put your name next to it, Norman, because you brought it up first.
Okay.
Okay, and then there's the bicycle.
I've forgotten how your acronym goes.
BISCICOL.
Okay.
Taxonomic names. That'd be Stan. Wrap up from this meeting. And then, let's see, test bed.
You've got another one, just I ran out of, okay.
We can put them over here.
Yeah. Ken just also decided to quit.
Is there another, there's a green one.
Yeah. Okay, meeting wrap up is what you call the fourth one, fifth
Yeah,
one?
meeting wrap up. And then, let's put, test bed.
Test bed.
Our identifiers can go up there.
And, yes, identifiers.
So I would like to if I'm going to do the taxonomic names, what I think is appropriate, I would hope is that maybe we could begin by being merged or in joint session, so to speak, with Darwin Corp. Buffalo, so that we get a little bit of a review on the foundation classes and how they're starting out and how we fit in, and maybe get some key questions about.
So you're saying you start out merged and possibly?
And then when they start getting deep into what's an occurrence and a specimen and a blah, blah, whatever, and all the rest of that, then maybe we'll branch out and go deal with taxes.
Okay.
Names.
Okay, so maybe, I think that's it. Was there anything else that I missed? Is there anything obvious?
Just a question. Well, is anybody willing to help with the test beds and so on for the airport a little bit before the wrap up? I mean, the end tomorrow.
When are you leaving?
11:30.
11. There's 5 or 6 people leaving at 11:30, and I would suggest that we're going to try and do most of our wrap up before that.
Does that mean nobody wants to help?
Okay, so maybe we should get a head count for each of the groups. What do you think? We'll just to see how big the groups are.
Okay, so.
And I guess you just have to choose one group, I guess.
Okay, DWC BFO. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and a fraction. Okay, 7 there. That's what I saw. Governance. 2, 3, 4, 4. Okay. Bicycle. 6. Taxonomic names. 2. Okay.
3.
Sorry.
There you go.
Any more? 3? All right. Meeting wrap up.
I'm going to break my own rule.
Meeting wrap up.
Myself? You're going to leave it all to me?
Yeah, that's it.
I'm going to be very efficient.
Yeah,
with this.
and I'm in there too. Okay, 3.
3.
And test bed.
One,
3,
2, 3, 4.
4. Going once. Okay, 4. Identifiers. Oh. Solipsistic identifier. That's good.
I'll take care of it. At least you're unique.
Yeah.
The official adoption of this group is easy IDs.
Anything else? Anybody want to try to suggest, hey, you want to meet at 6 or 7? Oh, sorry, you said someone's.
Well, I will suggest for the bicycle folks, maybe we'll meet in the lobby at, we say 6:30? 6:30 in the
As
lobby.
opposed to meeting tomorrow.
Well, yeah, maybe we can get it done tonight, then we can join one of the other groups tomorrow morning.
Okay.
Or maybe we want to continue.
Okay, so we got a bicycle suggestion tonight. Yes?
I just like to say that they've hidden BFO2, and before we can start with it, I'm trying to find the latest version, so if I can get a hold of that, I'm willing to put this stuff in there as a start tonight,
Okay.
before tomorrow's meeting, to at least get that.
Okay.
If people want to meet to decide what branch or what sections of the Darwin Core to use as an example, that could be something that could be done tonight, and I'd be happy to have dinner with people.
Ramona, I sent out, one of the emails I sent out, I had copied everybody transparently, so you should have everybody's email.
Yeah.
It was on the list. If you do get that done, or if anybody else has anything important like that they do tonight, send it out.
It might not, I'm a morning person, so it might happen early in the morning.
Okay, well,
but
whatever.
Okay.
Don't just say.
Are you doing it in Holland?
I will do it now, yeah, okay. If you've already done it, send it to me.
Okay. Chris?
The hotel has a number of meeting rooms, large and small, that I'm sure you can just walk into and assemble. At the back, you go to the back on the first floor, and also downstairs on the floor below, lots and lots of meeting rooms. If you want to caucus there.
Okay, and for some reason, I got a hotel room that has a giant private patio on the 4th floor. So if anybody wants to meet outside, let me know.
What group are you in?
Huh?
Yeah, what group are you in?
Wrap up. This has to happen at the end.
So what are we going to say? Are we going to meet back here in this room at 9? Or are we going to say to the groups that they can figure out where, if they want to meet at the hotel and then come back here for the last wrap up?
I would think, what's that?
Can I just suggest, because I think some of the groups might stagger, maybe some of the groups might finish early and want to join some of the other groups, and then if we don't know where you are,
Right.
it's going to be a big problem. So if you could do it
So you're
all-
suggesting it would be a good idea to start here?
Yeah.
Yes.
So all the groups start here at 9.
Okay, you want to do it at 9?
Yep.
Okay, nobody's voting, I mean, for even at 11:30. Does anybody want to suggest 8:30 just for the convene, or do we like 9?
8:30 is 8:30.
8:30.
If we did 8:30, then we can go 8:30 to 10. Take a short break and then
Then
do a
come back
wrap
and
up
report. And then
before the 11:30 departure of everybody. So you have an hour at the end to wrap up.
Okay, so here at 8:30. And the idea will be to break pretty quickly. So it's not like at 8:30 we start drinking coffee and chatting for 20 minutes. It's come in here, decide what the groups are, where they're going to be, and go. And if you show up late, then you have to find out where the group went that you're going to be part of. One other thing I would mention, Bob raised the issue that we ought to be planning on producing a document, a database test bed, some artifacts that come out of this meeting that can drive something else. That suggests that either we have a strong commitment to delivering written products tomorrow, or we have a commitment to following up after the meeting and producing written products. In my experience, most people find it hard to find the time after they get home after having been gone for 3 days to drop right in and do the writing, so I'd suggest that to the extent possible, it'd be really nice if everybody could try to produce at a minimum some clearly articulated bullet points, and preferably with some prose wrapped around it to help make some sense out of it. We do have video, but that requires looking at when we do the reports. But let's remember that our goal is this is part of an ongoing process. This will succeed to the extent that it continues and builds momentum, and that's our really number one goal coming out of this meeting, is what happens after the fact as a result of the momentum that we establish. Anything else?
I was going to suggest a group picture, and maybe one of these guys want to take it. And I'm not sure where a good spot for a group picture. Do you have a suggestion for a group picture location? Out in front?
Across the street on the stairs of the Natural History Museum provides a natural platform.
Right.
Maybe we can just say, grab your stuff as soon as we end. 5 minutes later, we'll just truck over there with all
For
our
a group
stuff.
picture? Okay, so we're going to do a group picture 5 minutes after the first person leaves the room or the last person leaves the room? Anyway.
5 minutes after we said the meeting is
After
over.
we clap our hands and say it's over. Yes, Norman.
So what's worked for us, as you know, Bob, in the past is when in these breakout groups, if somebody can nominate a scribe and maybe
Yes.
add something to the Google Doc.
There you go. Yes, if each group nominates a scribe and you work on the Google Doc and put a section in there that's a header for your section and get stuff into that, that's really helpful.
Do we all have access to that?
Yeah, which doc is this?
Why don't you know what, for each group, if you could just create a Google Doc, share it with me, and I'll put it in the Semantics of Biodiversity Google Doc folder, and then we'll have access to it. So.
Okay, so we have that commitment. Each group will have a scribe and you will capture it in a Google Doc. Okay. Anything else? Last call for anybody to have a comment. Okay, we're adjourned. The 5-minute clock starts.